The horrible death of Henry VIII. Introduction. Henry VIII, one of England's most powerful and controversial monarchs, left a legacy defined by religious revolution, political upheaval, and personal scandal. Yet his final years were anything but majestic. The man who once ruled with strength and vigor died in torment, ravaged by disease, consumed by paranoia, and surrounded by fear. His death was not only physically gruesome, but symbolically fitting for a king whose life was marked by excess and conflict. A once vigorous monarch in decline. In his youth, Henry VIII was the embodiment of Renaissance kingship, tall, athletic, charismatic, and cultured. He jousted, hunted, danced, and debated theology with equal enthusiasm. But by the time he reached his 40s, the physical and psychological toll of his reign began to show. A disastrous jousting accident in 1536 was the beginning of his undoing. A horse fell on him, and he was left unconscious for 2 hours. This injury never properly healed, and the infected leg wounds turned into chronic, ulcerating sores. These ulcers emitted an unbearable stench and leaked constantly, making movement painful and often impossible. His once sculpted body bloated to over 400 pounds, and Henry was reduced to being hoisted by mechanical devices to move around his palaces. The physical agony. By the final years of his life, Henry's body had become a prison. His festering leg ulcers refused to heal, and doctors of the day were helpless, using poultices and cauterization that often made things worse. He was also likely suffering from conditions such as type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and possibly Cushing's syndrome, a disorder that could explain his extreme obesity, mood swings, and skin conditions. Every day was a torment of inflammation, infection, and immobility. The sores constantly reopened, oozing pus and blood, while his joints ached from what may have been gout or arthritis. Reports from his court describe his increasingly foul smell, his need for padded chairs, and his growing frustration and anger. Mental decline and paranoia. The pain Henry suffered wasn't just physical. As his body deteriorated, so too did his mind. He became paranoid and suspicious, seeing betrayal in every corner. Once a skilled diplomat and theologian, he now relied heavily on sycophants and feared even his closest advisers. His mental instability was evident in his treatment of his wives and courtiers. He had 2 of his 6 wives executed, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and his later reign was marked by purges of ministers and nobles, often on thin or fabricated charges. Henry's 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, narrowly escaped this fate. She nursed the king during his final years, but even she was briefly accused of heresy. Fortunately for her, she managed to reconcile with Henry in time. The final days. By January 1547, Henry was a shell of his former self. He spent his last weeks bedridden at the Palace of Whitehall. He was in constant pain, suffering from fever, leg inflammation, and possibly kidney failure. Physicians were hesitant to tell him he was dying. knowing the king's fury could turn lethal even in his final hours. It's said that when he finally asked for a priest, it was the first open acknowledgement of his impending death. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer arrived to give last rites, though by then Henry could no longer speak. Cranmer asked him to squeeze his hand if he accepted Christ, and Henry did his final recorded action. A grisly aftermath. Henry died in the early hours of January 28, 1547. But even death did not bring dignity. His body, so swollen and diseased, began to decompose quickly. It was placed in a lead-lined coffin and left for several days before being moved to Windsor for burial. On the journey, legend claims that the coffin began to leak putrid fluid, seeping through the seals. According to a story recorded a century later, dogs were seen licking the dripping remains, an eerie fulfillment of a prophecy made by Friar Pito years earlier. Whether true or not, the story has endured as a grotesque symbol of a king brought low by his own excesses. The legacy of a dying giant. Henry VIII left behind a divided court, a fragile young heir, Edward VI, and a nation still reeling from religious transformation. He had severed England from the Catholic Church, dissolved the monasteries, and centralized power like no monarch before him. But he also left a legacy of bloodshed, debt, and unresolved tension. His death was as chaotic and visceral as his reign. Though he had envisioned himself as a new Caesar, mighty, immortal, unchallenged, Henry VIII died in pain, reviled by many, and encased in a coffin that could not contain the very body he had once glorified. Conclusion. Henry VIII's death was horrible not only in its physical reality, but also in its poetic symbolism. His grotesque end mirrored the destructive path he forged as king. A ruler of grand ambition and grander appetites, he died surrounded by pain, fear, and rot, a tragic finale to a reign that reshaped the course of English history. I have tried to highlight some important issues on behalf of our channel. Please support me. I am ending today's video by inviting you to watch the next video. Goodbye.